Welcome to Believe It or Not, an Interfaith Grand River program. I'm your host, August Edelman, and I'm joined today by Héctor Acero Ferrer, who is the interim coordinator
Yes.
at the BA program at Martin Luther University College.
Yes.
Well, thank you so much for being on the show.
Thank you for having me. It's great.
So tell me a little bit about yourself. What does it mean to be an interim coordinator, and what is the BA program?
Martin Luther University College is a college that is federated with Wilfrid Laurier University, and Luther has one undergrad program and master's program, like an MA, an MDiv, and then a PhD program. So out of those four, I am the person who oversees the kids coming out of high school and then entering the university life. The BA program is in Christianity, Interfaith Dialogue, and Community Engagement. So those three pillars of work is my life, and hopefully the life of the students too and the faculty. So lots of organizing courses, making sure that students are served by the institutional structures and processes. So that's what I do, and I also teach. So that
Cool. What do you teach?
I teach a few courses, but I'll give you a sense of two of them.
Okay.
The first one, which is the course that got me into my job originally at Martin Luther, is Engaging Youth Cultures. So it's a course on youth empowerment, youth engagement, particularly from the through the lens of faith. So how faith commitments, theological orientations allow students to participate in public life.
Right.
That's one of them, and the other one is the capstone project course for the program. So at the end of the program, the students need to do a thesis-like project, and I get to work closely with them and supervise them in that work, learn from them as they develop their programs going forward. So I do a lot of just community of learning setting, like being a facilitator to their interests and helping them find resources, all of that. So
That's really cool. Well, so I know I'm particularly interested in the interfaith conversation part of that, which I know is one of the reasons that we kind of got connected through Interfaith Grand River. Can you tell me a bit about that and sort of why that's a part of the program and the importance of it?
there are different ways of getting at that, but I'll give you maybe the most generic answer first, and then the most
Sure.
personal one second. The generic one is we are in a multi-faith setting. Wilfrid Laurier University is a university that receives students from all faith traditions and no faith tradition at all. All those students come and take courses in that program. Therefore, our courses are multi-faith courses, and we are responding to that need, but by creating structures and processes that allow an interfaith conversation within the classroom. So again, that's the most
Yeah.
generic answer. The most personal one is interfaith dialogue has always been a passion of mine. I'm someone who has always kind of inhabited the margins of the traditions that I've been, even though I'm so committed to the traditions out of which I come out. But because of that, it puts me very close to the traditions that are neighbors to my own.
Mm-hmm.
So figuring out the dialogue between traditions has been always fascinating to me, and finding out what kind of how memory informs all of that, how imagination informs all of that. So those are my two areas of research, and they've become areas of research because they've been areas of interest for me in relation to faith and spirituality and religion.
Right. Very cool. So actually that ties in perfectly to my next question, which is tell me a little bit about your kind of backstory. What traditions did you grow up in? And tell me a bit about yourself.
So I grew up in Colombia. I came to Canada when I was 18, and I grew up like most Colombians, Roman Catholic, practicing, not really understanding well what my expression of Catholicism was. It seemed to me as a teenager, and as a teenager that was involved in church things, then it was just that's what Roman Catholic churchgoers act like, and that's what the churches look like, and that's what worship looks like for any Catholic around the world. And it was only after my arrival here in Canada that I realized, oh my goodness, that's my experience of being religious, even within my own tradition, is so different from what it means to be Catholic in Canada. And it took me several years to recognize what informed that, and there were several things, but one of the aspects that I decided to research more around, just for my own sake, but then it became my academic practice, was liberation theology. So this theological movement in Latin America that emphasizes social justice, but particularly the attention to the periphery, to the margins, to the poorest of the poor. What do those at the margins need to tell us about life and the world and God and or divinity or however you want to call it? And somehow it seems like in our texts, in our sacred texts, there is a constant call to, oh, those who are at the margins are the ones that have to get the answers first. They get to hear some echo of something, so we better pay attention to them because they are the ones who are the messengers of that very important part of information that we need to respond to as Catholics or Christians or people of faith or people of goodwill. Many different terms are used within that tradition to describe that. So that really was the kind of Catholicism I grew up in, church in which people were heavily invested in projects that had to do with social action, with the poor, with those who were really experiencing the worst of the violence in Colombia. And what was preached from the pulpit, what was said every Sunday when we went to worship together was had to do always with the other. There was very little content about the self, and that comes with its own issues, but it's an other-oriented experience of church. So that's part of what I grew up with, but I also realized that there was so much influence of indigenous spiritualities in the kind of Roman Catholicism that I experienced in my local churches, so I can't really generalize. But there was a lot of wisdoms, like indigenous wisdoms, that were present in the way in which worship was done, in the way in which the community gathered. Lots of the music had a lot of those elements in it, and it was maybe we're just missing it all from here. When I arrived here and I experienced the Roman Catholic Church in Canada, then I started missing all those elements and thinking there was something special to them, something that I need to understand better, maybe articulate better for others, and hopefully codify in academic language so that people who read that through the lens of theology or religious studies or philosophy can get a glimpse into the wisdom that those communities have. Yeah. So that's a little bit of the...
That's really fascinating. I remember many years ago when I was in undergrad taking a course that talked about syncretic religions and this idea of sort of taking that the way Catholicism has been practiced in Latin America is not the same way it was practiced in, say, Spain, because of influences of other traditions. And that makes something that is still Catholic, but has these different kind of facets, I guess. Yeah, that's interesting.
And like, I think that it also goes back to your question about it, like interfaith dialogue, realizing that there was so much diversity or so much hybridity within my own faith experience. Realizing that made me a lot more willing to entertain the idea of dialoguing across religious boundaries. Is the other within and the other without, is that idea. Then once you realize that you are really some sort of fragmented self, then recognizing the diversity and the difference outside of you is also becomes something good. So
beautifully put. Thank you. That's really interesting. So you've sort of touched a little bit on this around the interfaith and the sort of outward looking part. What are some of the kind of core ideas of your tradition or your practice that sort of you hold close to your heart, that sort of shape what you do and how you live in the world?
I think there are several things, and I maybe a proviso to this answer. I think that I will give you a different answer every day.
Yeah, fair.
Here, but how I'm feeling today is, I think that what I mentioned before, the attention to those at the margins. In my own research, I do a lot of turning back to devotional texts. So not only theological texts, not only academic texts, but looking into what people used to pray. And there are many different types of prayer in Roman Catholicism in Latin America. Many of them are developed kind of tangentially from the church. They are adjacent to churches, but they are not right there. They are small groups of people that gather and pray together, and they develop their own ways of praying. They recite the same sorts of prayers. They adapt prayers that come from the tradition and then add some things to it. And in looking into those prayers, particularly the prayers around Christmas, so the time right before Christmas we call Advent. But lots of those prayers in Advent have a really strong connection with the figures of those narratives who are perceived as poor or marginalized, and how those figures were able to perceive the divine first. How those figures were, this message was audible to them and they recognized it. They saw the divine, they recognized it, and the rest of the people didn't. So to answer your question, so that idea of looking to the margins to get the answers that we need to change our world, to make the world more just or better or more peaceful, that's one thing that stayed with me. I think the second part of my answer will be around community, around the fact that while individual prayer and individual, like the kind of more contemplative portion of religion is important, God is made present through community, and not through the nice part of community. So that's one thing that is important to liberation theology. It's not, oh, we all come together and it's just in this harmonious exchange we see God. No, it's in the fight. It's in the coming together and not knowing what the text says. And then you see something, I see some other thing, and then we like hash it out until something comes through. And like that dissonance, that cognitive dissonance, it becomes really important because it's out of that you generate a world in common, a faith in common. But you can only generate it with others. Otherwise, you only have your perspective. That's the second part. And I think the third part of it, which is really overlooked when people look at liberation theology, they think about liberation of the oppressed. The oppressed are important, the marginalized are important, and then the rest, whatever with the rest. That's not really true. If every text connected to liberation theology says something around the liberation of those at the margins is the liberation of everybody. And is that very simple logic that if you consider that person that has the greatest accessibility issue, everybody between that person and the person that is the most mobile will have access to the space that you're thinking about. So the same idea applies, that when you consider those at the margin, like everybody else will experience the same kind of liberation, because we all need to be liberated as a collective. And being liberated is a very vague term there, but it is moving to more human conditions, being dignified or humanized, or there are many different ways of putting it, but I'm just giving you a glimpse into what that looks like.
That's so interesting. Thank you. One of the things I find so cool about getting to have these conversations with people is seeing where the overlaps are, sort of going like, oh yeah, we have something like that, and oh yeah, like that sounds like what you're describing. That the third thing sounds like we call the curb cut effect in disability, where we talk about how the creation of cut curbs at intersections were designed for people who use wheelchairs, but of course anybody who struggles to lift their feet up, anyone who has a stroller, anyone who's carrying a lot of stuff or has a rolly cart full of groceries, all benefit from the curb cut. So it's that okay, you designed for these people and it benefits everyone else too. So anyway, I just think it's really neat to see those overlaps in these kinds of ideas. But thank you, it was really interesting. Can you tell me about a time when maybe your faith has been a challenge to you, or conversely, if that's not been the case, where your faith has helped you to overcome a challenge?
In terms of when faith has been a challenge, so I have to give you a little context for this, and it's not necessarily an easy story to tell, but when I grew up as a Roman Catholic in a predominantly Roman Catholic country, I expected everything in my life will be aligned somehow. Like, you experience the same kind of faith that everybody else does. You have no problem interacting with anybody else because they understand the language you're using when you're talking about faith. And then I always was very academically inclined, so I wanted to study things, I wanted to question things. That led me to study philosophy. And I studied philosophy at the National University of Colombia, a place that is a public university, the largest university in the country as well, very reputable, but also a place that, because of its connection with the government, is extremely secular. I would say maybe militantly so. So I arrived there as a philosophy student who came to philosophy because of questions of meaning, which have to do with the divine, and arrived at a philosophy department that didn't have the ability to host those questions. The questions were philosophical. It was an excellent program, but those questions of large meaning, when they had to do with the divine, needed to be suspended.
Right.
So I really had to fracture my life in my professional life that was emerging in the academic setting that was purely secular. I needed to sanitize all my language to be able to be there and to succeed, to be understood, and also not to be treated with hostility, because I knew of cases of people who have gone with their faith in that setting and had encountered a lot of hostility. And then when I was outside of the university, have a life of faith, which for me has never been private, as I told you before, is always about action in public. Faith compels you to help people, to, like, even if you can't do it well, you need to do it. So that schizophrenia, that divide between those two persons was very difficult to navigate, and to the point that what I chose to specialize in philosophy was philosophy of science, so something that was very opposed to what my original questions were. And what I decided to do at church was something very tangible. So I will do, like, work with the community that didn't have a lot of thinking connected to that, so that I could really separate myself into two. Somehow Canada was the friendly environment in which I was able to bring those two worlds together and think about philosophy as philosophy of religion, ask those questions in the context of academia, and continue to ask them. I don't have answers to any of them, but at least I have more questions now. So that's the story of challenge, and that was very formative to me, both in positive and negative terms, and connected with that journey to kind of the moment in which faith was like served me in a very tangible way was there is a law that is foreign when you leave your home country, and you leave everybody behind. I came on my own. There are a lot of suspicions around people who immigrate to a place because you don't really know what they are coming, and you always assume people want to come in, and like, oh, they want to come to Canada, they wanted to leave their place because it was horrible or something like that. No, I did. If I could have, I would have stayed in the place where everything was familiar. But I ended up here. But in that transition, arriving here and experiencing as an 18-year-old what a life that was very different looked like, faith was recognizable to others as a point of contact. And others' faith was also recognizable to me as a point of contact. So the first relationships I developed here were connected to faith, and not with other Roman Catholics, with other people of faith from other faith traditions who were experiencing something similar to what I was experiencing. That who were arriving here, who had a community of faith back at home, and being in Canada was different, was challenging, and we were experiencing the same. And on the other side of it, arriving into faith communities here that created that first connection to Canada through the faith community. And I know it's not a unique experience to me. I know almost every immigrant of faith has some sort of experience like that. But to me, it was very important because it helped me in a spiritual way. It helped me intellectually, but it also helped me in a very tangible way. It gave me a physical space to be in. So that's...
Yeah, I've seen, and some of the folks you've talked to, seeing that kind of experience reflected around coming here going, okay, well, it's the same, but it's not the same. And that adjustment, right? So I guess my other question would be, you sort of mentioned a bit about the community back home versus the community here. How does your faith impact the community that you've built around yourself?
Well, it does quite a bit.
Yeah.
I'm not someone who is very vocal about my own faith tradition. I don't, even though in what I've said it somehow appears like I put it out there. I don't. I'm reserved. I'm an introvert by nature, so I will not share that easily. But I do develop relationships in which I want to be able to talk to people about what they really care about. And even with my students, a lot of what I do is around something that I call burning questions. It's something I learned from a professor of mine. He always asked people for their burning questions, and he gave with that expression, he gave me a language to identify what I care about. Those burning questions people have and walk with. So most of the communities that I've created or that I've participated in or that have organically formed with me being present are communities precisely of that. Communities of where people have burning questions, and their ways of answering those questions are either through service or through study of their sacred scriptures that they consider dear to them, through interacting with one another, having that dialogical exchange around liturgy, about the way they worship, or simply the questions of meaning that they have that have always bothered them, and they haven't encountered a religious kind of sounding board to those. So I'll tell you about a couple of the communities I inhabit. I told you already about the students, which I consider is one of my communities. Yeah. But my community of my closest friends is a community in which a lot of what we do is constantly kind of reimagine what it means to be kind of a person of faith in the world, and what it means to serve as a witness. Like, witness is a very Christian term, but to serve as a model of that kind of work for others, and but also being critical about it. So lots of what has happened recently with my closest friends is that is all about being critical. Like we need to be critical of our own tradition, critical of the ways in which we operate in the world. Are we really listening to those at the margins, yes or no? So that informs a lot the communities in which I am. I also, as a Roman Catholic, I'm part of a kind of a worship community, so I'm part of a church. I always try to kind of be a member of that church, like be formally involved and try to like participate in their life. So I've always kind of sought out communities that also more closely align with those values. That one of them being kind of interfaith dialogue, so community churches that are doing some of that work already. I've connected to churches, weirdly enough, through I've been part of many interfaith groups, and the interfaith groups have a church representative in them.
Yeah, yeah.
And then I see, oh, well, that person came out of that church. Let's go and explore that church and see. So I go to my community of the people that are part of my same faith tradition through the interfaith space that I feel is safer somehow than some of the churches within my own tradition. Yeah, I think that gives you some answers to your question there.
That's really interesting. How sort of Venn diagram of overlapping spaces. So I guess my last question is there anything that you kind of like, oh, I hope she asked me about this. I really want to talk about this. This is an idea that's really dear to me, or some idea that you'd like to share with the people at home?
Well, maybe something about interfaith dialogue. I've always lived in the tension between interfaith dialogue is an answer to many of the problems we have in the communities. Is a tool we can use. Is a practice we should refine. Is a space we should inhabit. All of those things. And the other side, interfaith dialogue is impossible. When we think about people holding on to their faith traditions, and the dogmatic core of those, because all traditions have some sort of statements about life and love and interaction in community relationships that are very close to the core of who they are as people. So how do we, if there is a dissonance between one and another, how can we actually have that dialogue? So my message for the world will be for people to learn to inhabit that tension creatively, to know that those two poles will always exist, that on the one side the impossibility of interreligious dialogue is palpable, is there, we're going to experience it. There are many moments in our interaction as people, as citizens, as people out there in the real world, that we're going to experience that and not going to be able to move past that. But there are so many other moments in which we're going to see the fruits of that interaction really serving the community so much, and serving ourselves in our own journey of faith, understanding our own traditions, and understanding how our traditions really intersect with others. But again, those two will always accompany us, and not despair on one or simply rest on the laurels of the other one, but navigate that tightrope wisely. And I don't know how to do it. I just know that the problem is there, again, the question. And I will want everybody who engages in interfaith dialogue to think about that as they move forward.
Mm-hmm. Well, and that's a doing space. You're talking about the action and the doing it in the world. That space between the immobility of not being able to dialogue and the ease of having great dialogue is a space of action. It's about practice and effort.
Yeah. And so one
go for it.
It's a space of action, effort, but it's also a space for maybe this is not the right word, so you do whatever you want with this, but kind of emotion and passion. And my tradition, or the part of my tradition that is inherited from the Jewish tradition, there is a space for lamentation and sorrow and frustration with the other, with God, with maybe we should rest there. Maybe sometimes we just sit down and lament together. And most of our lives are lived in those moments of joy or those moments of deep sorrow. We don't go to a funeral expecting to resolve the problem of the person who died. We go to a funeral so that we can cry next to one another. So maybe that's what makes a space of action and expression of what we're feeling, what is inside us. So without harming the other, just simply being alongside one another. So that is a hopeful message to end with.
I really like that. That's a really interesting perspective, and certainly resonates with some of my experiences talking with fellows and colleagues of different religious backgrounds. So that's interesting. Thank you. Sorry, I sort of feel like, that was really great. Thank you so much for being on the show, Hector.
Thank you for having me. This was great.
Yeah. And thank you for joining us. We'll see you next time on Believe It or Not. That was really interesting. Thank you. I feel like I've got more to think about now.
But it's all in the questions. Like now, I am thinking. I have a class later today, and I was thinking about how to reshape some of that based on these conversations.